University. And our second discussant is Dr. Sayema Haque Bidisha, Associate Professor, Department of Economics, University of Dhaka. Again, I'm requesting the discussants, the presenters, to please take their seats on the stage. I would like to invite Dr. Minhaj Mahmud, who will present his paper on transitions between informal and formal employment, results from a worker serving in Bangladesh, to please take his seat on the stage. Then I'd like to invite Mr. Iqbal Hossain, who will present a paper on labor supply and its changes during 2006 to 2016, focus on gender and regional differences. Finally, I'd like to invite our research director, Dr. Kazi Ali Toufique, to please come on the stage. Dr. Kazi Ali Toufique will present his paper on assessment of livelihood, skill and employment situation of indigenous and tribal people in Bangladesh. I'm again requesting our discussants, Dr. Sayema Haque Bidisha and Ms. Simeen Mahmud, to please come on stage and take their seats. Now, I kindly ask the Honorable Chair, Mr. Rizwanul, Dr. Rizwanul Islam, to please conduct this session. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much to be here, and it's my pleasure to be here this afternoon at this session on labor market issues of the BIDS research seminar that is being held this year. I must thank the BIDS for having invited me to come over and share this session with you. As you must have seen, we will have 3 papers to be presented during this session, and there are 2 discussants. I was told initially that the paper presenters will get 15 minutes each, and also the discussants will get 15 minutes each. I thought of making a little change here with the permission of all of you, particularly the paper presenters and the discussants. If you don't mind, I would like to give a little more time to the presenters, let's say 17 to 18 minutes, no more than that, please. Actually, when they have taken up their 15 minutes, I will remind them, and I will hope that they will be able to finish off in the next 2 or 3 minutes or so. As for the commentators, I request them to finish off in about 12 minutes or so. Okay, is that all right? So if that is the case, then may I propose another thing? It is customary for chairs to keep time and at the end thank all of you and leave. I'm sorry, I'm not going to do that. And on that, I have taken a decision very democratically, without consulting any one of you, that I will make a few observations right at the beginning. Because I know that towards the end of the session, everybody will be impatient to go away or to go for tea and coffee. But I will not allow you to leave without listening to me. So before I call upon the presenters to make their presentations, if you don't mind, I will take just about 3-4 minutes to make a few observations on the issues of the papers, not on the papers, not on the presentations, because I don't want to preempt anything. Of course, I did have the benefit of seeing some drafts, in one case, a few pages of summary, in a couple of cases, the PowerPoint presentations and so on, but I can assure you that I will not give you any preview of those presentations. I will simply share with you a few thoughts on each of these topics. To start with, the transition between informal and formal sector workers. Now, I'm very glad to see that this issue has come back to the table, and researchers are taking interest again in the issue of informal sector, because if I am not mistaken, I have not seen any work on the informal sector in Bangladesh during the last decade, or even more actually. Actually, almost the father figure of research on informal sector is someone called ATM Nurul Amin, who is now chairing the economics department at BRAC University. And after that, of course, some work has been done, but I have not seen anything during the last several years. So I'm very happy to see that. Now, having said this, I would like to share with you my perception. I feel that there are basically two kinds of perceptions about the informal sector. One taking a rather positive approach, starting with the 1973 discovery of the informal sector by an ILO mission in Kenya. There is a group who think that informal sector can have potential for capitalist development. So these enterprises are embryos of capitalism. But there is the other side, the other group of researchers who think that this basically represents what we call distress adaptation to a dire economic situation. One tends to fall back on such activities when there is no other alternative. One has to eke out a living. So there are these two different perspectives. And one perspective would say that this is a transitory phenomenon. As economy grows, capitalism strengthens, so we will move from informal to more formal sectors. But the question is whether we are seeing this. Whether you talk about Bangladesh or any other developing countries, Bangladesh has been growing at decent rates during the last more than a decade. Whether the informal sector has actually declined or not, this is a question I don't want to answer, but I'm raising. On the side of the workers, again, we know very high proportions, but we'll leave it to the researchers. There is the issue of the quality of jobs. We know that everybody is employed. In Bangladesh, only 4% are unemployed. But whether this generates a decent living, I'm not talking about ILO's concept of decent work, but even lower than that. So these are some of the issues that I would like to leave or share with you. And finally, on the side of policies, what can be done by public policy? I don't know whether the presenters will come to that, but I think this is an important issue. And there, I would like to at least highlight two major things. One, the issue of protection against ill health. Think of the multitude of workers working in the informal sector. If a person falls ill for a day, what happens to him or her? And the second is protection against old age. When one becomes old, one tends to depend on one's next generation. There is no other protection. So at least these are two areas of possible public policy that I would like to leave on the table. Coming to the paper on gender, I'm quite hesitant to say much because there are experts sitting next to me and on this dais and amongst the audience as well. I have seen references to what we call the U-shaped curve of female participation as economy grows, participation rate declines, and further subsequent levels of development, participation rate increases again. Does it have to be the case for all economies? Does it hold for Bangladesh as well? If not, how do we explain that? And so on. So these are some of the issues that I thought could be highlighted. And from the point of view of policies to raise female employment, what are the factors that are amenable to policy making, public policy particularly, and of course in collaboration with the private sector? Then there is a demographic aspect as well when we talk about women's participation. What happens to slightly older than young women? For example, when you go to a garment factory, typical garment factory, I don't know whether you have seen anyone over 40 years of age. In some connection, I raised this question. What happens to those who have become older? I don't think we have got answers to such questions. And not just garments, I think labor force in general, we need to look at this. And I have seen that the term regional has been added to this presentation. So I was wondering whether there is a regional dimension to gender issues or whether there is a regional dimension per se. What are we trying to do? This needs to be looked at. And finally, the third paper, Livelihoods of Indigenous and Tribal People. Again, I don't claim to have any expertise on this. So I would simply like to highlight one issue. When you talk about livelihoods of indigenous people, I don't know whether there is any difference between indigenous and tribal, but I will use the term indigenous. There is an issue of the source of livelihood and interlinkage between economic development and the livelihoods of such people. In Bengali, one often uses three words: jol, jungle, and jibika. And one has to remember that these three are extremely interlinked, and more so in the case of the indigenous people. Now, when we talk about typical growth, do we take these into account? Or we simply look at the structure of livelihoods and employment and so on, wages or so. Okay, I think I've taken quite a bit of my time. I would now like to go to the presenters, and I shall go by the same order in which they have been presented, they have been mentioned in the program. First, the topic, paper 1, transition between informal and formal employment, Minhaj Mahmud. You take your 17, 18 minutes from now. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, for joining our BIDS Research Almanac. I would like to thank also Chair again for giving a nice introduction of the papers being presented, the issues, of course. So I am presenting a joint work with several people from Bangladesh and RAND Corporation USA, Italo, Krishna, Farzana, Shanti. And this is a part of a project that we have several of the research coming out from this project funded by ISA. And I would like to also mention that I'm a newcomer in labor market research, so I'm sure distinguished discussants and other participants may have a better knowledge about the labor market issues in Bangladesh. So, as Chair has said that the two perceptions, one perception is about distress adaptation. Probably we will have an answer to that, whether this is distress adaptation or not, going into informality. So The research is about transition between formal and informal market. We will, of course, define at the beginning what do we mean by formal and informal in this research. Of course, there can be debate about defining informal sector and formal sector, but the issue becomes important as that informal sector accounts for majority of the employment in low-income countries. So we thought we should define informality or formality as a continuum rather than 0-1 thing. So it can start from safe working condition, minimum wage, sick leave, paid holidays, maternity leave, termination notice, contract, most importantly, and pension. So it can be less formal or more formal. So, and as you can see that from casual labor worker, less formal, we can go to very large manufacturing sector, which can offer you more formal employment. So we would like to see it as a continuum when we talk about formality and informality. So we define informal sector that characterizes workers employed with few benefits, self-employed and unpaid family members in an enterprise. And for informal firms are less productive than formal firms. Perception they pay worker less. They may not provide benefits to which workers are entitled. So these are the characteristics, and as some points are highlighted, there are divergent views on how informal sector responds to growth. One view characterizes the sector as stagnant and unproductive with few links to the formal sector, predicting that informal sector will disappear as the expansion of economy and formal and informal labor are substitutes. And there are cross-country evidence showing this kind of prediction. An alternative view characterizes the sector as allowing entrepreneurship, providing flexible work hours, locations, and providing supply links to formal sector, and which predicts that informal sector will still exist and may even thrive as the economy develops. So in the case of Bangladesh, we see that Bangladesh has developed substantially over the recent decades. At the same time, the share of formal employment has been stubbornly low. So the issue has come into the discussion among policymakers and, of course, among the researchers to look into the issue, whether these people are locked into informal employment, which we want to investigate, and how and whether workers transition between different types of employment that we define formal or informal. So these two basic questions that we are trying to answer in this paper. So we conducted survey of workers from Dhaka and Chittagong, surrounding urban areas of these districts. So we collect their job history, current and two previous jobs in past 15 years, so that we can address the issue of transition, which was previous job, whether they're moving to a job with fewer benefits or larger benefits, or whether they're moving a job more formal or less formal. So we also collect working conditions, and as a part of the entire research, we also do some other exercises to understand how people value the characteristics of formality. So survey locations in Dhaka and neighboring areas and Chittagong, because we wanted to address more of the smaller farms that are located into this area, and also medium-sized farms. So we have done our sampling in two stages, where initially we draw 80 musas using probability proportional sampling from the census, and then Dhaka, Narayanganj and Gazipur, Chittagong we took, and then we find the households going into those musas using an approach called random walk that we throw every 5th or 10th household. This is a standard approach. So, and then we enumerate all household members and collect their job history in the beginning to ascertain a sample that we will finally use in our research. So we sample all of working adults. Finally, in the second stage, we sample working adults stratified by gender, because to have enough female, we interviewed all female working according to our questions, and we survey all men in relatively small who was domestic worker, and then from those who are working in larger employment types, from there we draw randomly. So we have different types of employees here. Government employee, private employee working in private enterprises, domestic worker, day laborer. We have self-employed who does not employ anyone, self-employed who is hiring only family members, who is hiring non-family members, and family member in household business, paid or unpaid. So we have this categorization in the survey. So as time is short, so I will not focus on each of the slides as much as proportionately, but as you can see here, some sample characteristics, the age, education, the training, employment type, and industry, we categorize how our sample looks like. For example, we have highest number of people in the age group of 26 to 35%, and we have some people, there is a good distribution of people depending on educational background. Interestingly, people not receiving any training constitutes a large proportion here. So we also ask working conditions and other issues. So and we ask for people who are self-employed, because this is an important thing that we wanted to focus here, why people move from a private employment to self-employment, or from any particular category to self-employment. We find that a large number of people, 45%, are saying that I wanted independence or be my own boss. Next to that, we find that they also are looking for higher income. And when we analyze, probably this will come into the future slides here, that we have seen that people transitioning out to formal employment are actually earning more. So we find that desire for independence is more commonly cited among those with more education. So educated people moving to self-employment, they value more of their self-independence. And of course, in all analyses, because of our stratification of sampling, we have used sampling weights in analysis. So you can see that benefits by employment type. So in our sample, we find that government, if we categorize government employees, private employees, and casual workers, we find that, of course, naturally the government employees enjoys more of the benefits that we list, and the situation of casual worker is worse in all cases. So the table shows you the reported benefits by employment type based on current employment type at the time of survey, and casual workers include day laborers, seasonal workers, domestic workers, and apprentice. Now, if we show you some statistics looking at earnings by employment type, we see that casual worker, different categories of people there, and you see self-employed category is coming after the government employee. Even self-employed are earning more than private employment in some cases. And then we also show their hourly income in different percentiles. More interestingly, we look into the duration of employment in current job. So as we say that we take people's current job and all the benefits, working conditions in current job, and we go back and ask what was their previous job within the last 15 years and the previous job before that job. So we collect this kind of information. We see that the median duration is for after the government employee, we find that median duration in current job is self-employed. So casual worker category again, after that we have self-employed both category here. So we see that people having a number of jobs in last since 2000, we see that most people have one job, but there are this shows that there are over 30% people had two jobs, and some people had three jobs in this category. So we try to see the survival curves by employment type in this kind of duration data, because we don't see after 15 years. So this kind of right translation, we do a non-parametric estimation to show that the duration in particular type of employment, and we find that government employees, government jobs are longest duration, and after 5 years of employment, only 5% leave their job, and this proportion increases to 12% and 15% after 10 and 15 years. So, and after that, we look into the characteristics that affects marginal median duration, and we see that marginal effects. We see people having less education, people having higher education, they are staying in a job, in a particular type of job, less amount of time. So they have better transition potential. So we ask people about main reasons for leaving previous jobs. We find different categories and main reason for separation from there, and we see that there is transition between different jobs. The reasons cited are terminated, farm closed, and different sort of reasons, and we find there are various reasons some person is leaving a different job. But the most interesting table here is the transition that we see. If you read the row heading that we see transitions a government employee to government employee, we see these cells represents probability that someone working in government what is the probability that the next job will be also government. So you see that there is a transition between same type of jobs, but people, the attrition is a bit quite noticeable, that although they are transitioning between same type of employment, but in the same type of employment they are also not staying for longer. So this table shows you the probability that a worker who leaves a previous job of a certain type transitions to a new job of a certain type, say 47% chance that a government employee will go to government employee will go to private employee, and this is, you can read about it. So then we look into the changes in access to employment benefits between job transitions, which means that, so in the previous job you had a written contract, so what is the probability that the next move you are making, that you are moving to similar sort of benefits whether you are receiving. So as I said previously, that we observe this transition in same employment type with benefits type. In two cases we look into the contract and termination notice. So, and that shows that probability a worker who leaves previous job with certain level of benefit given by transitions to a new job of a certain level of benefit. So if he had a written contract in the previous job, in the next job he had a probability that he will choose a job with written contract, the probability is 48%. So if he has no verbal contract and then he is going to a verbal contract, he had a verbal contract, going to verbal contract is high. So the transition is similar type of employment. And we can also see that change in the number of benefits.
3 minutes.
Change in the benefits, so people are moving, there are substantial number of people moving to the next job with higher benefits or lower benefits, so they are still moving. And then we look into the correlates of job transitions into both all these categories, and we see that less educated workers are stuck in casual employment more. So if we want to conclude this, we find that active transition across different employment types and benefits, although workers are transitioning from one job to another are most likely to remain in same type of employment, we do see substantial amount of attrition between employment types. So people stay in certain type for limited number of time. Those people who are leaving private employment move to self-employment, and transitions from private employment to casual work are more common among those with lower level of education, so there is a downward risk, whereas transition to self-employment are more common among prime-age jobs. So when workers are transitioning out of private employment, they tend to exhibit gain in median earnings. About half of those leaving private employment retain the same number of employment benefits. And voluntary quits are related to access to larger benefits, so we find also non-negligible risk of downward mobility in terms of access to employment benefits. So if we want to sum up this discussion, that we see that informal sector contains elements of both traditional and segmented view and both dynamic entrepreneurial view in our case, and there is substantial upward and downward mobility in terms of choosing an employment, and of course the distress adaptation, probably not, because self-employment is not an activity of last resort, and moving from wage employment to self-employment is associated with higher income. We have limitations, of course, in this kind of observational study of employment transition suffers from problem of unobserved heterogeneity issue, because workers with greater abilities will sort into job with higher earnings and higher level of benefits, making it difficult to tease our preference for these benefits. So in a companion study, we look into those things. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minhaj, for a very clear presentation and also for maintaining the time so well. Very interesting presentation, dispelling the notion of either extremes that the informal sector represents, a dynamic segment of enterprises or distress adaptation. That's very interesting. We now move on to the second paper, and that is on labor supply changes in during 2006 to 2016, focusing on gender and regional differences. Iqbal Hossain, please.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Chair. My paper, this is not a completed paper. I'm working on this. It's a work in progress paper. My paper is focused on the labor supply and its changes during last decade, and focus is gender. Why this paper is focused on gender issue like female labor force participation. Female labor force participation is a very is a driver of growth and also indicator of to measure potential of a country to grow. Further, economic activities that can create financial accessibility for women and which may increase their empowerment as well. But the degree of the impact of economic activities depends on the sources of the employment. This study is not is the first study. There are several studies done in Bangladesh on the female labor force participation. Bangladesh has experienced an increase in labor force participation over the last 2 decades, and this increase is partly the natural due to the moderate level of economic growth in the country. There are, as I mentioned, there are several studies done in this area. I want to highlight these most important 2 studies done in Rizwanul in 2006 and 2013, and the Minhaj Mahmud in 2016. In Dr. Rizwanul in 2006 and 2013, they try to estimate the determinants of the female labor force participation in different employment categories. They focus especially on the employees and self-employed categories and the other employed categories. In the Minhaj Mahmud in 2016, they focus on the paper to try to estimate the determinants of the different employment categories divided in unpaid family members, regular wage employees, irregular wage employees, and the same employees categories. But the female labor force participation varies in different age group, and also in different level of employment, different types of employment. So, my focus of this study is to estimate the socioeconomic determinants of the female labor force participation, and also try to estimate whether these determinants are changing over time. And are those determinants are also diverse from different age groups, say youth and adult, and as well as for the different employment categories. So the brief literature about what determines the female labor force. There are major two types of literature focusing on individual determinants and the macro level determinants. The first one is the micro level determinants. This suggests that female participate in the labor force to maximize their individual or their household to the welfare. And the macro level literature suggested that female labor force has a U shape that is determined by the structural factors of the country. In this study, I focus on the micro-level determinants. So at the first view of the female level of participation, a set of micro-level like individual characteristics and also some household level characteristics, and also the geographical characteristics are play an important role for the female labor force participation. As I mentioned, the previous studies on the female labor force participation in Bangladesh examines these factors in depth, but do not go deeper by employment categories, especially the recent youth inactivity and high unemployment rate among the youth population. This paper tried to find out the determinant factor for female, not only by the age group but also the employment categories. So before going to the estimates of the different determinants of the female labor force participation, let's focus on the trends of female labor force participation in Bangladesh in last 2 decades. You can say that in female labor force participation has increased from 15% to 36% from 1995 to 2016. And there is also a rural-urban variation. Before 2005, that's urban female labor force are more participating in the labor force compared to the rural counterpart, but it becomes reverse after 2005. So what are the most important determinant to increase this rural female labor force participation? There is a high growth of self-employed category and unpaid female family workers in the livestock and poultry, and growth of the ready-made garment sector in the rural female, and also the better enumeration. Before say in 2019, the BVS incorporate the unpaid family female worker into the labor force. After that, this female labor force participation increases. Where these 36% female are working. If we categorize them by employment status, you can see that on more than two-thirds of the female are employed on own account worker or contributing family helper, and only the 1/3 or less are employed in the salaried job. So those who are own account worker or contributing family helper, they are engaged in own vegetable production, or they are helping their livestock or poultry. So it's important to know about the factoral pattern of the female worker over the time. If we categorize them in broad 3 categories, you can see that most of the female are employed in agriculture sector, especially in crop sector, and the industry sector. It has a slightly increasing pattern, except 2013. In 2013 LFS data, there something happened. Maybe I don't know. Maybe there is some measurement issue here. It shows 23% are female workers are employed in the industry. But if you exclude 2013, then you can see a slightly increasing pattern in the industry sector, especially the manufacturing sector. So, and in the previous slide, you see that after 2010, the urban female labor force are decreasing, whether the rural female worker is increasing. So why happens in the urban female labor force are decreasing? Because of you can see the agriculture in the urban sector has dropped after 2010, but industry sector is increasing in the urban sector, and also in the rural sector, rural area, except 2013. So there are also interdivisional variation among female labor force participation over last 4 survey period, and you can see that in Sylhet division all the round has the lowest female labor force participation among the divisions. So it's important to know how economic growth appears to be to benefit the male and female. The economic growth appears to, if you see this data, economic growth appears to have more beneficial for the female labor force. As the economy is growing, the more female are employed in the labor force compared to the male. But after 2010, the elasticity of the female employment is falling. It's become inelastic, and especially the youth group. Youth female means 15 to 29 groups. You can see in 2016 to 6 to 10, this period, there is a high elasticity of youth employment. But after that, it falls, and in last say 2 data implies that there is a negative elasticity among these youth female. So it is very important to see what determines the female labor force participation by dividing the age group. So let's about some more statistics about the youth unemployment and inactivity. In 2012, the ILO has one survey, and they revealed that 25% of the youth are inactive. Inactive means they are in 15 to 29 age group. They are not student, and they also are not looking for the job, and they are not employed as well. So these group calls inactive, and among this 25%, female are more compared to the male one. And if you see in our country, the national unemployment rate is around 4%, but in female group, the unemployment rate is, especially the youth one, is 11% in 2006. So, and also this unemployment is varies among the education group. In the standard literature says, as the education level goes, so more people will more be employed in the salaried job. But if you see this comparing to 2013 to 2016, more youth are unemployed who have tertiary completed education compared to the other. So this is the alarming. So I used the labor force survey data 2010 to 2016, this 3 survey period, to estimate the determinants of the female labor force participation. In the first revision, I used the logic one to estimate the determinants of the labor force participation, and the second one I used in only the 2016 data to determine the employment status of the female labor force participation. If I go to the result, in the previous, there are lots of studies, as I mentioned, they have some results. And in my study, I have, since this is a time limitation, I will focus on the what are the new results I found compared to the other studies. So, as other studies, individual characteristics are the play important role in the rural and urban. So one new result is that having additional female member and elderly person at the household level have significant positive influence on the urban female working in the labor force. And also the Muslim, those who are Muslim female, they have lower probability to participate in the rural areas in 2010 and 13. But this changes in 2016 data both in rural and urban, which is suggesting that social norms are changing, that accepting female in the labor market. And training and tertiary education play an important role for both rural and urban to participate in the labor force, especially we will see in 2016 for the employees category. And another important result is having remittance income have negative influence both rural and urban female to participate in the labor market. And if we go to the divisional level analysis, and we can find that Sylhet and Bidisha has lower probability to participate in the labor force compared to the other. And if we compare to how these determinants are changing over time, compared to 2010 and 13, 2016 survey data showing that there is a higher probability of more rural female are coming to the labor market compared to Dhaka rural, because Dhaka rural is the reference period except Sylhet division. Now I'm going to my second analysis, that what are the determinants of the employment status. Employment status means there are 4 categories: inactive, unemployed, employees, and self-employed and casual worker. So if I go to my findings, that youth female has less probability of being inactive compared to the adult female, and more probability of being unemployed also. And there is a rural-urban differences. The opportunities are unequal among female living in the rural and the urban areas. The urban female are more employed as employees, less employed in self-employed, while they are tend to be more inactive compared to the rural counterpart. And remittance receiving both external and internal remittances, household youth have higher probability of being inactive, less probability of being unemployed, being employed, both in employees category as well as the self-employed and other, compared to the agriculture income receiving household. And there is a significant variation of the employment status of female among divisional level. Female are more inactive and unemployed in all divisions compared to Dhaka, and also less employed as employees and more employed in self-employed and other categories. And the probability of female participation in salaried job becomes negative in non-poor household and also played positive influence on the self-employed. So the non-poor poor household female are more employed in self-employed and other categories. So what are the conclusion from these results? The youth are more interested on salaried job compared to the self-employed, and these differences more visualized for female youth compared to the adult. And the employment elasticity for female employment are inelastic, which implies establishment are switching for or moving capital intensive technique, and this will require more skilled worker in future. And as the technological advantage is taking place in all sectors, thus prior training can improve the female labor force participation. Higher rate of unemployment among educated youth, suggesting job market mismatch, and that can be reduced through job-oriented and technical education, which will create more job opportunities. And remittances have a negative impact on the employed of female employment. Proper training and encouragement can involve those remittance receiving household females in small business or to using those remittances. And some reasons like Bidisha and Sylhet are lagging behind compared to the other female employment. There is a policy intervention requires to create more jobs in those areas.
Just 2 minutes.
And having additional female and elderly person at the household level increases the probability of the female labor force participation in the urban areas, which suggesting elderly people can help working women, especially with the working mother, and also demanding good quality and available childcare in urban areas in future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Again, another very interesting presentation. And again, good use of time. Congratulations. Some very interesting results have been presented. I would say some are a bit surprising, goes against the expected hypothesis. Some contradict each other. I'm not going beyond these observations because there are competent commentators with us, so I'll leave it for them. But what I would suggest is, since I heard that this is a work in progress, I would suggest that when the full paper is written up, this be shared with experts, others who have worked or who are working on this issue, because it's very difficult to get a full sense from such telegraphic presentation in such a short time. So if I may suggest that the full paper be shared with others. Okay, now we go to the third presentation. The third presentation is on livelihoods issues of the indigenous population of Bangladesh. Before I give you the floor, one small correction. I said জল জঙ্গল এবং জীবিকা আরেকটা জ বাদ পড়ে গিয়েছিল জমিন জল জঙ্গল জমিন এই তিনটি মিলিয়ে তাদের জীবিকা ধন্যবাদ প্লিজ
Thank you, Chair. I mean, it's quite an interesting situation. Normally, we face a time constraint. You have 15 minutes. But this time, I have 3 or 4 minutes surplus time. So I have to get used to it. If I speak more than 15 minutes, that's cheap talk, maybe surplus words. This is a work we did for ILO. They wanted to know the employment situation of the indigenous and tribal peoples of Bangladesh. The livelihoods, it contained 3 parts actually, livelihoods, or what we use the term socioeconomic condition, and skill and employment. Today the focus will be on mainly on employment. As you can see, I had several colleagues who work with me. Actually the main part today comes from others than from me. So I hope I truly represent. I shared my slides with them and they said that represents the spirit of our finding, which we did last year. Okay. The objective, as I said, was to understand the skills and employment situation of indigenous and tribal, I just say ITPs. It has a fairly large sample of 10,000 households, and it is biased towards more from the plains than from the hills because we know more about the ITPs living in the hills, and I think ILO and SDC, they were more interested about those living in the plains. So this is by no way it's a representative sample. We presented the results separately. We put averages of hills and plains, but most results are separated. And we did probability proportionate to size sampling. We had this community series from the 2011 population census that gives us the percentage of different kind of IDPs in different regions. And we use qualitative and quantitative data. As I said, this study is not I mean, it's not proper research as such, but I think it's important for several reasons. One reason is that the sample, as I said, is large. And then we try to compare the findings with what happens with rest of the population like Bangladesh. So when we talked about unemployment or employment or types of activities, we found out whether the ITPs, how far behind they are or similar to normal or we Bangladeshis. So this we tried to do, but not for all variables because the information wasn't available. Another thing that makes this study interesting is we estimated some typical labor market variables like the one presented by Iqbal and also presented by Minhaj. We talked about unemployment, labor force participation rate by different class. So I think these are the things that were not available when we did our study. In that sense, it adds new information to our knowledge about the indigenous and tribal people. I will very quickly present what the chair called livelihoods. I use the term socioeconomic conditions because that will help understand the following, the labor market indicators. We measured poverty among the IDPs and we found that, well, here we merged the result. We find that about 38.2% of the households are poor. And this can be compared with the recent HIES figure of 26.4. Our data was roughly 2015-16, so it roughly marches with the same period. So definitely the extent of poverty is much higher. And it is higher in the hills than in the plains. And interestingly, in the hills, the incomes are higher. Actually, they're similar with the plain income, but in the hills, income inequality is much higher than the plains. So what makes poverty higher in the hills is more due to income inequality than due to income. So this is one aspect of poverty that we notice, the difference in type of poverty between people or ITPs living in the hills and in the plains. And since I knew I only had 15 minutes, so I didn't use the figures and the graphs, which I initially thought I would present. So let me just talk about this Jol, Jungle, and Jomi aspect of livelihood the chair was saying. We have this in our report. I mean, in general, they have very poor housing conditions, mainly kacha houses, very insecure rights to land. They were living on public property or on private people's property, so their rights to land were very insecure. Ownership was less compared to what we see in, among us. It's a very high extent of open defecation. I mean, it's not like India, it's around 30-40%. It's very high compared to general Bangladesh figure. And at the education level, what we notice that up to primary level, it is comparable to the national level figures, but after primary, it sharply declines. It sharply declines at the secondary level. But surprisingly, it gets very high at the tertiary level. Very high, I mean maybe 2% or 2.3%. It is almost similar to Bangladesh figure. Possibly it picks up from some more educated people from the hill tracts, definitely not from the plain part. And the extent of migration is very low. We had some internal migration. International migration was 6%, 5%, or 2%, something like that. So these are the socioeconomic characteristics that I pointed out. Another access, it's not only limited access to water, the water is not safe. For example, the hill tracts, they have very uncertain access to water because the water either gets polluted or dries up. They have to walk long distance. So we had this, this is a common knowledge, but we have numbers saying, that indicates how difficult it is to get good quality water particularly in the hills. So now we'll go to the labor force aspect of the ITPs. The labor force participation rate is higher than what we see at the Bangladesh level, and it's higher for male than for female, which is also the case for Bangladesh population. But labor force participation of male is lower than the national level, but the female labor force participation rate of the ITPs are higher than at the national level. By national level, we took the rural national level because our households are all rural households. So we compared the ITPs with the national rural figures. So the main thing is that labor force participation rate is higher than the national figure. And it follows the economically inactive population is also lower than the national level. It's around 37% of total working age population. The national figure is around 41.3. And it's also true for the national figure. Inactivity is higher among females than males. Unemployment is very low, it's almost non-existent, it's 0.37%. and 0.28% in the plain and 0.78% in the hills. And the national figure is around, as the chair was saying, around 4.13%. And unemployment rate was higher in tertiary graduate levels at the standard finding that, the more educated you are, the rate of unemployment is also high. Underemployment is 8.5%. Again, it is slightly lower than the national level. I don't have the national figures here. It is much higher in the plain and across occupation. You see it high among the agricultural day laborers, and across industries is in the agriculture sector that we found more underemployment. So we have employment by occupation. Again, it's 48.25% are employed as agricultural day laborers in the plains. Involvement in agriculture as day laborer is quite high in the plains, around 55% as compared to 16% in the hills. Self-employment in non-agriculture, which is normally high in Bangladesh, but here we found around 6.7% with 13% in the hills and 5% in the plains. Employment by industry. Well, as expected, the largest portion of ITBs are employed in agriculture, around 72%. Where at the national level is 55%, 55.3% national rural. Share of manufacturing is 10.4%. Manufacturing employment is more prominent among females, but it's not like 25%. It's very more than that. And employment by education level, ITPs without education account for larger share of employment. Again, so we got the same finding that as you go for higher education, you have less employment, more unemployment. Informal unemployment is quite similar to national level. It's around 90% compared to national level of 87.5%. Informality is higher among women. This also, I think, peaks from the national trend. Informal employment, service sector accounts for largest share of informal employment, which is around 41%. Wage we found is pitifully low. This is as low as 2,159, 2,245 for males, and it's even lower for females. Compared to national figure of more than 10,000 Dhaka. We checked our data, but that's the figures we got. It's extremely low. So now let's move to the skill level. So the skill of the ITP population is 43% of them have no minimum level of skills, and 37% have limited level of skills. That's the national level of measuring skills. Where the no skills required, you give the value of 1 when the activity takes no skills, and then it goes higher up. Skill shortage is more pronounced among ITPs in the hilly area than compared to those in the plain. So when we looked at vocational training received by the ITPs, it's around 2.64% compared to national rural of 2.7%, which is slightly less but very similar. So we also look at kind of trainings they received, which is basically mainly agriculture, followed by RMG, computer. I don't know what computer actually means. Maybe they have some hardware training, livestock, poultry, driving. And the other thing that we found is that about 41% of them, they are adverse to training. They're not interested to improve their skill. Then we asked about the kind of training they would like to have. Then number 1 that came up was crop production, followed by computer, RMG, motor mechanic, craftsmanship, and handicrafts. So I'll try to make an overall summary because I thought there are too much numbers, and I try to make a sense of the numbers. And the first thing that strikes to anybody is when you have almost everybody employed, but about 40% of people still under poverty, then definitely they are having a very low skill, low productive economic activities such as agriculture, laboring, petty trading, and farming. The human capital, as I said, is up to primary level, if they go to that level at all, and then it sharply declines, and there is a strong aversion to develop the human capital, and there is differentiation and polarization on various dimensions between and within the ITP communities. I mean, in the report, we reported these indicators in terms of each type of ITPs, Chakmas, Marmas, and all that. But for today's presentation, I've lumped them together because otherwise it would take a longer time. And the other thing that is clear from this study is that, we usually talk about a vibrant rural Bangladesh where, there is a sharp growth of the rural non-farm activities, agriculture, wages go up, non-farm economy thrives. That kind of dynamics, you don't see them among the ITP people. So these kind of dynamics, they have been totally left out from taking part in this kind of dynamics of the rural change for the last 10, 15 years we are talking about in Bangladesh. And the third observation that we made during our study is, we were told to look at the skill and employment situations, and we realized that this is too early to talk about them because they really have basic problem about sanitation, job, living, and they talk about employment, skill. I think is something looking a step forward. There are other fundamental issues one should address rather than going for skill. Employment, of course, there are important aspects of employment, but I think for most of the ITPs, it's a matter of existence than developing skill. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Toufique, again for a very clear presentation and for making good use of time. We have got some very useful, interesting information, and the conclusion is very clear that the rising boat has really not lifted the ITP, the indigenous and tribal population. We know the issues or the problems. And as he said in concluding, that there are other fundamental issues. Now, the million-dollar question would be, what are those fundamental issues? I don't know. The report may have fulfilled or satisfied the TOR for the agency that has funded this research, but I thought it could go a little beyond what has been asked to do, what they have been asked to do. For example, some macro level indicators like public expenditure on health, public expenditure on education, infrastructure, in terms of these critical variables, how those areas do compared to other rural areas of Bangladesh, at least, if not the urban areas. I thought that could be one way of throwing some light on what he calls other fundamental issues. Then another important question would be whether there is a reluctance on the part of the population itself or whether there are other problems. So it can be looked at from different perspectives, and I hope in some future exercise they can get into those analytical issues, although they may have satisfied the requirements of the donor. So anyway, now we are ready for the commentators' comments. Again, I will go by the order in which they have been mentioned. First, Simeen Mahmud. Of course.
Thank you very much. I thank the organizers, BIDS, my ex-home, for inviting me. And of course, I can never refuse, although I'm really not qualified to comment on, such broad labor market issues. I'll make my comments not very specific to the papers, but more generally. But still, I would like to start with Toufique's presentation. And I agree that it's really a beginning of trying to understand some of the more, not the more political, but the more economic issues, challenges that they are facing. One concern, when you gave the handout, there was no gender disaggregation, so I had a comment on that, but now I see that you have included that. But I was also wondering whether there was also class distinct dimension to the employment situation. You mentioned about some people having very high education, and because we know that they are organized around, it's supposedly a matriarchal organization. I was wondering whether that, I was hoping that would mean that, there would be some indicators of that in their skills and labor force participation. Apart from that, I think it is very interesting, and I think it goes to show that there are such pockets still. Bangladesh is growing fast. We are now into the SDGs and leave no one behind and so on, but still there are huge pockets where actually, huge subsections of population who are left behind. In terms of more general, a general comment is that, we know that, labor market is one way through which the benefits of growth and development actually are distributed among the population. And therefore, we would hope that as Bangladesh is growing and as we are trying to we reach out towards the SDGs, sustainable growth and sustainable development, somehow or other the labor market seems to be stuck. And it's not responding. Certainly it's not responding to what many have called the youth bulge. And people are talking a lot about the demographic dividend. And we now have a youth bulge, large numbers of youth in the working age group who have certain amount of education, but for some reason they are not being able to, the labor market structures are so rigid that they're not being able to accommodate this youth bulge, and this is particularly true for the female labor force. Bidisha may spend more time on about the determinants of female labor supply, but I think the more broader issue here is that we do have this, still we have this and it means that women who have a secondary level of education, SSC and HSC, are still opt to stay out of the labor market. And there are obviously reasons which have to do not only with economic barriers, entry barriers and mobility barriers within the labor market, but also a lot of very sticky norms. And women, women's work is still seen to be still determined and shaped by a lot of attitudes and norms. And one big a couple of big barriers in that respect is actually women's with the very unequal division of labor in the household, which has to do with household work and care work. And we actually have been working a lot looking at time use, and we find that the single most important barrier for women in terms of participating in the labor market. Because of the demographic transition, we have now a healthy workforce, women who are healthier, living longer and have fewer children and fewer care responsibilities, but still they opt to remain out of the labor market. And I think that that means that we need to look carefully at what the labor market is actually, where the barriers and structural barriers are. In terms of, this is in terms of the female workforce, but I think even in terms of the male workforce also there are barriers. And I think the paper by Minhaj actually sort of pointed to some of those issues. We also have been working, looking at trying to understand male labor market behavior, and I think the important distinction is not between formal versus informal or the continuum, but I think more in terms of wage and self. It's also about, the distinction is also about agriculture and non-agriculture, and also distinction between casual wage, daily labor wage, and more regular wage. And we find that men actually all combine, they do multiple sort of activities. So it's very sort of, I think, superficial to categorize them into self-employed versus wage-employed, in the agriculture versus non-agriculture. We found that the most important second activity for men was self-employed in agriculture. So even men who are doing formal wage work, school teachers, and NGO workers, were also doing being farmers on the side. So I think it's one needs to have a more nuanced and more dynamic picture of labor market participation. Otherwise, it's very difficult to identify where the structural barriers are. And finally, I want to just, I don't know how much time I have. Okay, maybe I won't take 5 minutes. Finally, I would love to talk a little bit about preferences. When we ask men about what was their most preferred activity, regardless of what they're doing, everybody said business or trade, or to be self-employed. And I think Minhaj has also said that those self-employment is, I think, more preferable to wage employment. So business or trade was the first, and the second was agriculture or farming. It was not, it was not formal wage work. And so you see that even now, I think there is something about actually participating in a labor market in terms of an employee means that, it's something that there are some sort of issues there which men will say that they would rather prefer self-employment or business or trade. And when we asked women what was the most preferable for them, they said self-employment inside the home. And I think that's not surprising. So it's self-employment within the home, poultry, livestock rearing, or small businesses. So while we are saying that we want women to participate in the labor market, we still have not created the conditions whereby they can actually come forward and participate. And the final point I want to make is that one reason that women have said they don't want to go outside the home to work is because of security. And I think the whole issue of sexual harassment in the public place, in the workplace, in schools and colleges, in the public transport, on the streets, is something that women have said over and over again. It's not that it's not so much that you experience sexual harassment, but the fear of sexual harassment is so strong that I think it's really acting as a barrier. And therefore, when you think of the labor market and why people participate or opt to stay out, you need to think not only about economic structures, but also about the social structures. Thank you.
Thank you. Some very interesting points have emerged, and that shows the limitations of just data-based work. Some issues simply are not captured by the conventional methods of collecting data. Thanks, Simeen, for pointing this out. And our next commentator, Sayema of Bidisha.
First of all, thanks BIDS for inviting me. It is indeed a pleasure to go through the papers and to be present in the presentations because Simeen ma'am has already pointed out about the overall labor market issues. So I would like to go by paper, and actually all three papers are very interesting, and it's really astonishing to see that some issues like informality and tribal people are working, and there are so many nice researches conducted in these areas. So first of all, if I just want to talk a little bit about the informal and formal paper, the first paper, I think it is indeed a very interesting paper, and I think it's in a very good shape to publish in a journal. You already talked about the main econometric issue that might come here, like the problem of unobserved heterogeneity. So I'm not going into detail on that. I think you have done quite a lot of interesting work. One thing is like this paper is a little bit similar to some work on occupational mobility or occupational switching, and there are some literature on these areas. Like there are some papers, I could remember there's one paper on with Danish data in Review of Economic Studies, and there are also some other work that has been done with ISA. So I think if you have a look at those papers, then you can also enrich the papers a little bit more. For example, there have been some work which has looked at the downward mobility and upward mobility. Obviously, in your paper, you are not focusing downward or upward mobility thing, but with that insight, maybe you can add something there, like from government to self-employed, from casual to self-employed. So these type of mobility, maybe you can check econometrically that one. I think that might be very interesting. You might find some very interesting things, because the data set that you have, that is really very nice, and I think the type of research that you have done, adding some more econometric or getting better insight, that will increase your probability to get published in a better journal. That is what I want to say. And I think you can also try to look at the transition matrix thing in greater detail, because in intergenerational mobility and in income mobility, these things are very common. So with the insights of transition matrix, you can check the, you already have some transition matrix, but I'm just wondering, maybe in general in the transition matrix you have some correlation, you have some significance, so you can, that will help to get better insight, and that will help to give better results. So that might be very interesting. And often in mobility literature, we have things like intergenerational mobility coefficient. So something like a coefficient that tells like what is the probability and to switch from one job to another. So this type of experiment, I think that can add some, you can get some further interesting ideas. Another thing, I'm just wondering, like, because you already have worked on median duration, some of the results are a little bit puzzling, like maybe I missed some of the points, like there's a negative coefficient with the wage, and some of the coefficients are insignificant. So I'm sure in the paper you have better explanation, and you have explained it much in a more rigorous way, what insight we can get when we are finding that some coefficients are negative for one group of type of activities and not for another type of activities. There I would like to add one point, is because there's a huge variation of earning between the government employees, private employees, and also the casual employees. So that's why when you are lumping these three categories together, so whether you will give another thought to have more disaggregated category and to look at it, because maybe that might help you to get some better results from an econometric point of view. That is one of my suggestion. And another thing is like whether it is possible for you to see that, holding other things constant, if a person is government employed, then what might be his probability to switch into a self-employed category. So this type of probabilities, in addition to transition matrix, I have a feeling that you might get much exciting results. So that is what I was thinking while looking at the paper. Otherwise, the paper looks really interesting, and especially with the data set. For the for the second paper, what I would like to see, what I want to add is that the paper, Simeen Madam has already talked a lot about the overall situation. So I want to say that I think for the female labor force participation, it would be interesting if you can disaggregate the category, the determinants, because you have mainly looked at the determinants. So if you can disaggregate the determinants, for example, some are push factors, like household wealth. For the females, how husband's education, husband's activity. So these are the push factors. Some are the pull factors, which are women's education, overall situation in the labor market. And then some are the gender norms related factor, marital status, number of children in the house, whether there is mother-in-law presence in the house. So all of these things, if you can disaggregate the categories, and if you can, in your paper, if you can present it in that way, I think you can get much exciting results and you can make it much more exciting. That is one thing I think it would be interesting. The second thing that I would like to add is like on the third point, like the gender norm-specific variables. Because we are talking about female labor force, as Simeen Madam already pointed out, I think it is important to focus on the gender norm-specific variables. And because in labor force survey, you already have some variables like number of children. Because what we have in our paper, we have seen that having children under 5, that reduces the probability to participate, but having children more than 5 years of age, that increases the probability of participation. So that is like, that may be one is the care responsibility and another is the responsibility or the burden of the thing like push factor, the lack of wealth in the household. So these type of things, you can get much more exciting pictures from there. So by focusing on the gender norm, because we are talking about the female labor market, that might be interesting. One thing I was a little bit confused because the paper that I had with me and the presentation, that is quite different, because in the presentation you have got lot of other variables and presentation. The one I want to focus on the youth thing, I did one paper which we still haven't got the luck to publish, so which is on the youth female labor force. So maybe I can share the findings with you, and you can just check that when you are talking about the econometric model, I'm not very sure, because in your explanation you have got the youth as an additional dummy. So, but I haven't seen any interaction term. So if you don't have any interaction term with the youth dummy, I am not very sure that whether you can compare or whether you can explain the way you have explained, like marital status have greater probability or education have greater probability. So when you are interpreting the results, I think because there were a lot of slides, so I was not able to go through all of the variables, and they were very small as well. So maybe you can, I think you have to be very careful about how you're interpreting. Maybe I missed some of the points, that is also, that can also happen. And some of the analysis, for example, like the impact of remittance. So what I was thinking that when you are finding the remittance have a negative impact on being employed, on positive impact being inactive, so how you can justify it, on whether you can see that can be some factors related to the wealth, but we have an hypothesis that with remitters we have better networking, and that might have a positive impact as well. So maybe you can have a better explanation. So that is some explanation that I think if you want to publish it, then the editors will want to review, will want to have a look at it. So these are some of the things that I want to say. And for the last paper, I think this is extremely interesting that we have data and on this area. I would be interested, and I think you will be able to provide some econometric analysis, like you can have some multinomial logic or some probit analysis of labor force participation, poverty, and you can check across different categories, like different tribal groups and across hill and across plain, and then we can have, I think we can have some very exciting findings, and that is what I think might be policy makers are looking for. So that is what I had with me. So thank you very much for inviting once again.
Thank you. Very solid comments, as could be expected from someone like Sayema. And in fact, I have heard for the first time, at least during the last couple of hours, words like publishing in a journal and so on and so forth. And why not? This is a research seminar. That's what we should be talking about, in addition to policies and so on and so forth. And if I were the authors, I would have appreciated these remarks and comments and suggestions very much. But on behalf of the authors, maybe I should thank you, Sayema. Service that you got free of charge. We now have, if we were to finish at 4:15, another 15 minutes or so. But if we could say, because we started later than scheduled, so if we could take another 5 to 10 minutes, we could extend this session to 4:20. Then I would take about 5-6 very brief comments, observations, questions from the floor. And then, to be fair to the presenters, 1 minute each at the end. Because after all, they have been hearing, listening to the comments, so they should have an opportunity to respond. So a few comments, but please be very brief and sharp. Not statements, not lengthy statements and observations, please. Okay? In 1 to 2 minutes, then we can hear more people. Okay? The floor is open. Anybody? To break the ice? Yes, of course, you can start.
Thanks, Kazi Ali Toufique and his other colleagues. Actually, I was alluded.
Excuse me, it would be good, particularly for my benefit, if you introduce yourself very briefly.
My name is Naran Chandranath. I am an ex-researcher of BIDS. Actually, my first, that's only one question actually. What's the limitation of your research work, research methodology? Are you satisfied with this type of approach of doing this type of research?
Anybody else? On this side? No? Oh, yeah, certainly.
Sorry, I'm Nazneen from BIDS. I could ask this question to Lintu Bhai later on, but I just wanted to know, you mentioned there is inequality is high among tribal people, and because you made several comparison between the plainland and tribal people, I was just wondering, the rich people in tribal area, how rich are they if we compare the rich people in the plain land? Because I thought that within the tribal people there is poverty and that is not much inequality. That was my conventional idea. So I was just thinking, how rich are the rich people in the tribal area? Another dimension that Simeen mentioned regarding women empowerment my conventional thinking is that tribal women are more empowered compared to the male there, because in terms of their labor force participation in agriculture and other areas. I mean, is that correct, what you found out in terms of empowerment, decision making and others? The women empowerment, usually we think because in agricultural activities and others within the tribal community, female participation is high, whether that has any reflection in terms of their empowerment, like decision making and others. Thank you.
Yes? Okay. After yeah. Okay, maybe. Dr. Ahmed? Yeah? Thank you. Comment to Toufique. You mentioned very insecure land rights for the ITP. Is there any evidence in your study about the reason why the land rights are uncertain? I mean very specifically land grabs of indigenous peoples, both in the plains and the CHT. Another finding of yours is that there is very low migration rate. And while I can understand that in a commonsensical way, I wonder if you have looked at the more historical and structural factors that have been affecting indigenous groups both in the plains and in the hills. In particular, what I'm referring to is forced migration, massive forced migration of the order of 100,000 people from the Chittagong hill tracts, both after the Kaptai project and during the counterinsurgency. I mean, I understand that none of that is expected to come into the findings of a questionnaire-based survey dealing with frequency distributions. But, you know, these are very important contextual issues. And before we conclude that there is very little migration amongst the indigenous peoples, I think we need to be careful. I have one other point about Simeen's question, about comments, rather, about sexual harassment as a constraint to female labor force participation. You know, in the 1980s, when we were discussing women's position and participation in employment, the talk was of patriarchy, joint families, cultural restrictions, so supply side constraints. And the interesting thing about Bangladesh was that these were being broken down. So patriarchy, if not entirely, but in terms of joint families breaking down, patrilineages breaking up into partitioning, and you have landless groups and so on. So there was the conclusion then was that if there are constraints to female labor force participation, these are demand side constraints rather than supply side constraints. Now, what you say now suggests that supply side constraints are coming back again, but in a different sense. And I wonder if you'd like to elaborate on that.
Okay. Dr. Anwar.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed the presentations. I am Anwara Begum from BIDS. My question is to Iqbal. You said that, and we did see, we are looking at this phenomena for a long time, that the labor force participation of women is showing a lower trend. Now, can you identify the reasons for this? Number one. The second is that, yes, women with tertiary education are nowadays finding less scope for work, or are they not getting into the labor force? Are they actively looking for work? And whether this group of women are not looking for, say, maybe options like international migration, etc. If you have any information on this, I would be really happy to know. Thank you.
Any others? Going, gone. If I may use another minute before coming back to the presenters, I think this comment has already been made, but I think a comment on data or comments on data have already been made, but I would like to highlight this again, particularly the limitations of some of the data that we work with. And here I would like to particularly mention the labor force survey data. Many of us are aware of the limitations, although they are very useful, of course. That's the only possibly the only source of nationwide data on labor market. So we have to use them. But on the other hand, we have to keep in mind the limitations of these surveys arising out of a variety of factors. First, of course, change in definition from one survey to the other, change in classifications from one survey to the other. So one has to keep those in mind before analyzing the data and trying to explain the differences. I will illustrate this with a couple of examples. For example, the paper on gender issues, labor supply. I wouldn't say it's only on gender and regional, labor supply. In one table, we see that employment elasticity of all, actually, both males and females, have declined very sharply between 2006-10 and 13-16 and so on and so forth. Just the table before or on the other side, we see that employment in manufacturing, female employment in manufacturing has actually increased sharply between 2010 and 13. And despite such increase, the elasticity of employment has declined. But also, if you look at longer term trends, 2006 to 2016, you will see that there was a sharp increase in 2013. So several of us have looked at this, and some are saying 2013 is an outlier. Others are saying, no, not necessarily. We have to look at the longer term trend, maybe look at 10 to 16 and so on and so forth. So these are some of the issues that I would like to highlight regarding the data and its limitations. And the second point, again, relating to data, is that many of the issues that we are talking about cannot be substantiated by data, even if we are looking at nationwide data. So one has to go beyond such data, and particularly those of us who work with micro-level data, both nationwide and survey-based, we should bear this in mind, and perhaps we could combine national level figures, estimates, with the micro level estimates to see how they compare. So that's another suggestion that I would like to leave with you. And before we conclude, as I promised, 2 minutes each, no more than 2 minutes, please, to the presenters. Again, I go by the same order. Minhaj first.
Thank you. Let me just say a few words on the data that you have said, particularly on the labor force survey data. Because labor statistics suffer from the measurement issues a lot, and particularly who is answering this labor force participation question is very important. And there is no research doing randomized control trial finding the difference between reported labor statistics based on whether household head is answering or female is answering. So this debate of not only limited to the definition and other issues. Let me thank Simeen and Sama Bidisha. Very thankful to you for responding to our request, coming here and giving very good comments. Although I have problem remember short memory, I can't remember data what you said. But two things I remember, you said about transition matrix. Yeah, we try to show this transition during the probability with transition matrix, particularly as you rightly pointed out in the beginning of your discussion that we were focused in this paper on duration. So, and our work is pretty much hopefully the right direction, but thanks for your suggestion. So we did not want to go into kind of multinomial logit analysis looking into job transition in that pattern, but we were more focused because we have the duration data, and we thought that the novelty of this paper is looking into this duration analysis. You pointed out median duration table probably, finding something unintuitively negative coefficients. We are showing here marginal effects and For higher educated, medium duration, for employment types in government, private, and casual. So you see, if people are higher educated, their median duration is slow. If you look at me, my job durations are very less, and I moved total evidence. So why it should be unintuitive, I don't understand. So, and also you look at the wage figures, so people are staying in a job. If higher wages, if people have more choices, they're moving. So so duration is, so that's what these marginal effects of duration analysis are listing. And thanks for pointing about publishing research paper and good journals. That's what we are trying to do. And thanks again for very good comments.
Thank you. Sorry.
Responding the question raised on the floor, Dr. Anwar Begum. Yes, from 2010, the urban labor force was 36.4, and in 2016 it is 30.8. So in the urban female labor force participation is in declining trend because of the decreasing the female employment in agriculture sector. And the second question, whether actively they are looking for job. Yes, in the slide, in the youth part, I showed that among the youth female, the unemployment rate is high. That means they are looking for a job. And due to the limitation of the data, the question asked in the LFS data is whether they are looking for the job last 7 or 7 days. And thank you for the both discussion and chair for the comments. I will try to incorporate those comments in my paper. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. The questions are personal as well as academic, but there is a convergence. I noticed that. Well, Nazmeen, we measured Gini coefficient for these people. I mean, I don't know the exact number for, but in the Chittagong Hill Facts, it's around 4, 6, something like that. In the plains, it was around 3, 7, 3, 8. So that's the objective kind of understanding of inequality between the two ITPs of the two regions. And about women's empowerment, I'm not good at explaining that. I mean, if you look at these tribal women, they are, typical question we ask the women whether they go out for buying or take decisions, things like that. They are definitely more visible, more mobile, but whether they are empowered, I don't know. We didn't have any empowerment index. We just looked at, we had a questionnaire on gender, which we could not compare with other Bangladeshis or other studies. But my impression is that in terms of mobility, taking decision, definitely the hills, at least apparently they're seen everywhere. I mean, you can see it from the labor force participation rate, where female labor force participation rate is higher than Bangladeshi rural average. But this is the best answer I can give to you. The third thing is now I mean, whatever I do in BIDS, I enjoy. I mean, all my work cannot satiate my intellectual mind. I do things that I like very much, I do things I don't like very much, but how you start a work, you know nothing, you have nothing, you got a TOR or you think, and then you collect data, then some ends up in a report, some ends up in journal articles. It doesn't necessarily mean that those that end up as journal articles I enjoyed most. It's not true. Some that end up in project report, possibly I learn more, I enjoy more. There is no clear-cut answer to your question, but I'm very honest in replying to your question. I think that is very individual, that goes beyond institution about what kind of work gives pleasure to anybody. That's all I can say. This work, as I said, I enjoyed. I mean, I learned a lot of things about them, but I didn't learn enough to answer questions Shopnadan asked. I don't have the capacity to understand the land grabbings. Maybe for that I have read some of your work, and other people who work about the historical uprooting from the common property rights, things like that. I know a little bit about that from consuming work done by others, not by myself. I didn't want to contribute to that literature. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think with that, we can conclude this session, but before closing, I would like to thank the paper presenters as well as our valuable commentators, and also thank all of you who have actively participated in this session. We conclude with a round of applause for ourselves.